I was expecting there to be absolutely zero thematic connection, but that was actually a perfect lead-in talk, because my talk is going to be all about designing in situations where people don't know what the hell it is they're doing. So you've had a bad idea, you've had a good idea, you want to make it happen, and you don't want to make it worse by not understanding how people learn things. So I'll start with a story of a good idea gone wrong. I was working in a design studio where we were actually designing physical meets digital interaction. So a lot of time working with physical things that connect to computers and the internet. And we got a 3G dongle. It was not that one. I don't remember what brand it was. So that we could connect to the internet when we were in, say, basements. And we couldn't get it working because we were all very smart technologists. So there was no feedback on the little screen UI. So we pulled out the manual and read through and we're like, okay, that little blinking light means something. If it's connected, the blue LED is going to blink every 200 milliseconds. And if there's an unrecoverable network error, the blue LED will blink every 270 milliseconds. This was noteworthy not because it was so egregious, but because it's so common. Both in things I've seen commercially, in sort of user experience that I see coming out of sort of technologist hobbyist realms, and certainly in mistakes I've made. So looking into this a little bit, trying to figure out what's going on, I ran into this nice list by Don Norman and Jacob Nielsen, and they were actually talking about touchscreen interfaces. And what was notable to me about that is, there's a lot of really accepted common basic issues of basic user experience and usability. And when you get a shiny new technology, the impulse is to throw it out the door, right? Like, I understand how to do things on a website. Now I have a touchscreen. I don't know what a menu is anymore. And sort of the point here is that it's not so much about the technology, but about understanding how people interact with and learn new interfaces. So to dive a little bit more into detail, I want to go through sort of characteristics of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about an unfamiliar interface. So one is it's something with an unusual input method. So something like a connect, so that reads gestures, so there's not really a clear sense of what the conventions are for how you interact with that. Or more experimental things, like something that you might interact with by bending a screen rather than touching a button. Also, in terms of input might be different, but also output might be different. So you might not have a screen like the 3G dongle. You might have a very small screen like on the Oyster card, that little LED thing. Or you could have a huge screen made out of Christmas lights in front of your house for playing Guitar Hero. So again, you won't necessarily know where to look or how to interpret the information that's being presented to you. That's true, he did Angry Birds this year, I think. And the last one is that often there can be a distance between input and output. Obviously, one of the benefits of the internet is that you can make things happen far away. And one of the drawbacks is that then sort of what you do and the result that comes from that can be quite far away, and you might never even see it. So all of these things have a lot of possibility, right? We tend to get in technological and interaction ruts, and it's nice to break that up. It's a good space to play in. You get people ranging from like somebody by themselves in their living room to actual like startups and commercial products, so there's a range. They're fun to make. They can make a sort of emotional connection that you sort of lose when you're doing the same thing all over the time. But if somebody doesn't know how to learn it and doesn't know what to do with it, you're not going to be able to communicate that excitement, and the project or the product itself is going to fall over. So I'll start by ripping apart a project I worked on. So last year, I worked on this project with a Kinect, where the idea was you would have, the Kinect would read your hand position, you would trace the shape of a letter in the air, it would take that into the computer, we would collect a bunch of them and get a sort of average gestural letter, and at the end you'd be able to physically 3D print them out. So we were playing with partly getting to know how a Kinect works, but also getting that sort of complete feedback loop from gesture to physical object. And this is roughly what the UI looked like. So you would walk up, you would see yourself, it would give you a little feedback when it detected your hand, and then there were some elements on the screen you interacted with to draw the letter. So the first thing that we learned upon user testing this is that most people would walk up to it, look at this, walk up to the screen, and touch the start button. People know touch screens. They don't necessarily recognize a camera or know what to do when they see a camera. So they had this sort of mental model of what computers do. This didn't match the mental model, and we did not communicate well enough what that difference was. So challenge one is affordance. If you have an interface that somebody's not familiar with, one of the first things they need to know is what they can do with it. And a sort of corollary to that is when you don't know what to do with something, and if it's trying to pick up your interaction, there's a good chance you're going to accidentally trigger things. So a lot of times, as people were figuring out how the camera worked, they would actually trigger the process, and then the UI would change a little bit, and then they'd get lost again. So this system ends up seeming random, even though it's not designed to be random, because there's not that mental model, and it's not clearly communicating what it is that you can and shouldn't do. And another corollary to this project is, I like to think of this as a Minority Report problem. When you're dealing with a physical interface, you actually have to think about people's physical bodies. So a lot of cameras, like sort of gesture recognition cameras, are really good at detecting this kind of movement, which is not a very natural movement. So you're actually limited in your ability to manipulate something because your muscles don't know how to do that very well. And over the long term, your arms are going to get tired. So either we're all going to have to develop very large shoulders, or you have to think about another way to have this sort of interaction if you want some sort of extended gestural interaction. So that's the end of me. So another couple of challenges that I've run into. What's this one? Another one on the input, right? There are drawbacks to things like touchscreens. They're not very tactile. They're very limited expressiveness. So there's a lot of projects that are looking at ways to make more expressive interfaces, give you something physical to play with tactile feedback, which is good, except, again, people don't necessarily know what a particular type of movement means. So you really have to understand what tactile feedback feels like and what sort of metaphors and models people have in their head so that you can understand, is that going forward or backward for a simple as a simple thing. Another issue, especially when you have your cause and effect are quite different, is the simple issue of feedback. This is a project, Bubblino, that if people send a tweet with a particular keyword, it blows bubbles. It's quite cute, and the guy who made it, Adrian McEwen, sort of solves the feedback problem by bringing it to conferences. So it's a load of people tweeting a lot in a confined space. So you're actually bringing that cause and effect closer. But the danger in this sort of interface is I might be over here tweeting by myself about, I want to go south by southwest to LA, and all of a sudden I'm causing bubbles to be blown somewhere in Austin, and I don't know what that's happening, so it's not doing anything for me, and people who are seeing it don't necessarily know why the outcome is being triggered. So there's that sort of long cause and effect, which can be quite distant, and then there's that question of what do you do locally to let somebody know that they've triggered something far away, or at the result side, to let people seeing the result know what it is that caused it. And similarly, I love the Oyster card. I think it's great. But another question that you have to think about, again, when you're dealing with something physical, that people are using different body parts and different senses, is how you actually communicate that feedback to people. If I'm taking my Oyster card out and touching it, I'm looking here. So it doesn't make sense for visual feedback to be on a screen over there. And I always see people sort of step on the wrong side, so they don't even know which screen they're supposed to be looking at or which doors they're supposed to go through. They partly solve that by having auditory feedback, which is good sort of when it's quiet and only a couple people, but not so helpful when there's, mass of people behind you and 10 kiosks in a row. And the other thing they do that's not so helpful is the little visual feedback is the error codes. So I'm still not entirely sure what error code 96 means other than wait, swear, and try again. So it's a mix. It's a mix of good and bad, but mostly the point is if you want somebody to interact in a particular place, you want to make sure that they're going to notice the feedback you give them where they're interacting, and ideally with the senses they're using to interact. And a lot of this is about the learning curve. So anytime you're going to, this is actually a model of learning curve in games. So the idea is if you're going to learn a new game, there's a lot of fun over here, but first you have to sort of climb the terrifying diving board so that you can dive into the pool of fun. You might not see the pool. You might not be able to know if anybody's there. It might be, sort of 50 feet high. So a lot of that is about not just not just designing a system that people are able to learn, but designing a system that people are willing to learn. There are a lot of ways to solve this. Again, part of it is if you're doing something new, give people some familiarity. Like work with existing conventions. So only break conventions when you have to, so that they actually feel like they have something to hold on to, a bit of a handrail as they're climbing the diving board. Similarly, be transparent. If you can see the fun, you're more likely to be willing to climb the diving board. Progressive disclosure helps. Instead of one giant board. You could have a lot of little boards with sort of pools of increasing depths. Video games do that quite well. And trust is an intangible that I guess sort of ideally is if you have a lot of these working together, people will get a sense that they can trust what you're doing and that the results are going to be worth it. So that's just a summary, right? It's not too difficult. It's cause, understanding what you can do, what your actions mean. Effect, getting feedback, being able to notice the feedback, understanding it, considering really the minority report problem, and dealing with the learning curve, giving people a reason to trust you and giving them ways to overcome the barriers. And like I said, this sort of new interfaces are an interesting space because you get this weird mix of hobbyists, technologists, designers, people who are in established professions, people who are new. So there are a lot of weird tensions because a lot of times you're actually solving technical problems, which is very different from solving design problems or user experience problems. And you know, it's good to solve one end or both, but it's more good to know which one it is you're solving. Also, if you're a hobbyist and you're doing this for fun, user-centered design isn't necessarily fun. So a lot of fun hobbyist projects probably aren't going to be super usable because that's not the fun part. A lot of times you get sort of driven by technical feasibility. If it's a new technology, there are limited capabilities. So there's a bit of tension between you really want it to work this way, but it just doesn't. And a funny thing about this that I always think about is that a lot of these issues seem super obvious in hindsight. And I'm like, why didn't I realize that? So it's this weird space between you're uncovering new territories and new problems. And once you've gotten it, you look back and you're like, that was a terrible mistake to make. But it is more in hindsight, and you have to just sort of be willing to realize you're going to do things kind of dumb as you're bumbling along. And I don't have any super great ideas for meeting those challenges other than not throwing out things you already know, not giving into that impulse to forget what a menu is because you have a shiny new touchscreen. So work with conventions and metaphors, understand mental models that people have, and really try to work with them rather than against them. On the physical side, it's really important to pay attention to where they're looking, what they can see, what they can hear, what they're doing with their hands or their arms or their bodies. That's the same, again, providing feedback where the interaction is happening. Even if the system is doing something over there, it helps to give some sort of interim feedback that's, again, transparent about whether it's success of the system or just that it's registered the input. And just continuing in building these sorts of things to think about your design intention, user test, iterate, and so on. That's it.